Professor Charles Hopkins is at York University in Toronto, where he holds both a UNESCO chair and a United Nations University chair. He played major roles in both the Rio and Johannesburg UN summits on sustainability. He was an author of Chapter 36 of Agenda 21, the Rio Earth Summit Action Plan on Education, Public Awareness and Training. We have asked Charles to speak about the process of ESD from Rio to begin to set the tone for the morning. May I hand over to Charles, please?
Thank you very much, Madhavi. Actually, today's work on ESD is in two parts. We have one of the plenaries this morning, and then it'll continue on, and there will be the afternoon plenary, and both of them will be looking at ESD, but often in a context of the relationship between education for sustainable development and also the Earth Charter, wherever possible. The context that I wanted to begin with and that I was asked to address was some of the similarities between ESD and the Earth Charter, and in particular the beginnings. So I'm going to make 3 points in my presentation, and because we have it set up with a timer, the only way that I can make sure that I get all that I want to say is to start at the end and work my way backwards. So I will tell you that there were 3 points that I made in my presentation. The first one was the similar beginnings at Rio. And then the second big point that I want to build upon is that both the Earth Charter and ESD are vital and timely and needed right at the moment, and there's good news for both. And the third thing is that I think that both of us would benefit from the synergy of the two coming together. Now let me go back up to Rio. I was very fortunate to be one of 10 people from around the world who was invited to be part of the writing process. As you know, after 1987, when they agreed to adopt the concept of sustainable development as the overarching paradigm in the world, we still had to figure out what does that mean and what should happen. And so we had the 5 years that were given to nations around the world from 87 until 1992 to figure out some actual action programs. Now there were a number of products that were worked on simultaneously. There were the Rio Principles. There was Agenda 21. There was the Commission on Sustainable Development had to be established and set up. And there were 4 conventions, 3 of which were approved, one on climate change, one on biodiversity, and one on desertification. We couldn't reach agreement on forestry, and that had to wait for a few years. Now, all of them had a program built into them around education, public awareness, and training programs. It was very, very interesting, but in Agenda 21, for instance, we had education, public awareness, and training was mentioned in all 40 chapters. Okay? Now, one singled it out, that's chapter 36, but other than the word country, education was the second most used word in all of Agenda 21. So it was there. Okay? But largely ignored. Right? They just sort of took it for granted. Now, out of the other chapters, we have something called SEPA. And now, SEPA is communication, education, and public awareness. And so that is the education programs that came out of the conventions on biodiversity and desertification and climate change. And they now sort of work together with education for sustainable development. The other important thing to know about education for sustainable development, it is not just education. We made a terrible mistake when we were developing the acronym, and when we just refer to it as education. It is really education, public awareness, and training. Right? Because so many people think, oh, it's just talking about children in schools. No. Okay? This has to be a concerted effort that moves much beyond that. Now, what is education for sustainable development? Well, in the beginning, what we tried to do, the 10 of us who were there, were trying to figure out what it would look like, because in our minds, we kept thinking about trying to add something else into the world's education systems. But when we realized that we have roughly 100 things such as global education, peace education, computer education, environmental education, I could go on and on. When I was the superintendent of curriculum with the Toronto board, every week someone would come with a binder and say, would you just put this into the curriculum? It's impossible. That is not, it's what we started with, but it was not the goal. The goal was to look at what would be the contribution of the world's education systems. What would be the contribution of the world's overarching public awareness systems, including advertising and so on? And what would be the contribution of the world's training systems, both in the private sector and in the public sector? So hence, it is a much bigger vision, and it is a vision that is slowly now coming into being. We are now finding countries and regions that are saying the very purpose of education itself is to prepare people to live in a socially just and sustainable manner. So slowly it is coming into being. Now let me go back to the second point, that both of these are vital and both of these are developing well. And largely, let me say, when ESD first came out in 1993, I say it was pretty well ignored, because sustainable development was largely seen as an environmental thing. Most of the world's ministries of environment took on looking for it, when probably it should have been in the Prime Minister's office or the President's office. But instead, it was looked after by ministries of environment, and in most countries around the world, ministries of education did not even hear about it. And so it crept along. In the 90s, quite slowly. By 2000, we had found that the secret to entry point was to get in with faculties of education. There are 60 million teachers in the world, but how do you engage 60 million? So we started working with faculties of education around the world, 35 faculties in 35 countries. That has now grown, so we have networks of faculties of education in 76 countries, and great progress is being made into what is locally relevant, what's culturally appropriate, because this is not one size fits all. Now, there have been a couple of historic occasions along the line. I think one of the first ones was Joburg, when the word got out that the Japanese government, that Japan, was trying to build a UN decade around education for sustainable development. That was a fantastic move that got governments thinking about it. You see, in 92, we were, Chapter 36, and education, public awareness, and training was seen as one of 40. By 1996, the UN Commission on Sustainable Development selected 4 of the 40 chapters as crucial: technology transfer, indicators, etc. But one of the 4 was education, public awareness, and training. But by 2002, we were talking about education, public awareness, and training as the only one with a whole decade around it. So that was a huge thrust. And then the launch of the decade in 2005, where each country had to come up with a plan. Now we had ministries of education adding their weight. And slowly we started moving from the backs of individual teachers who were doing things into trying to develop whole school approaches. And then from whole school approaches to whole school system approaches. And that's what we're looking at now. Bonn in 2009, which brought together the ministers of education from roughly 50 countries around the world was another huge step forward. And if you were going to look up anything on the internet, I would suggest that you strongly that you Google Bonn ESD Declaration. Okay, Bonn ESD Declaration, and you will see what the ministers of education called upon. They had to work together for 3 days trying to figure out what ESD was, and when they saw that it wasn't another little add-on, that it was questioning why are we educating people, and how can we use the world's education systems to move from a paradigm of development, which is mainly the underlying ethic and value of the world's current education systems. How can we shift from this paradigm of development to one of sustainable development, and the complexities that would be in that. Now, Nagoya will be the next big one in 2014, the end of the decade, where countries are going to have to come and talk about what did we accomplish, what did we learn, and where do we go from here? Already countries are saying, we had such a slow start, can we have a second decade? Which is kind of nice in UN terms. Now it never will happen, etc. But we will have to be creative in trying to figure out ways in which we do not allow ministries of education around the world to tick off, okay, we did that, now on to something else. Now, the third thing that I want to wrap up with is the synergy. Both the Earth Charter and ESD would benefit greatly from some sort of collaboration. Education for sustainable development, we're trying to move from education about climate change to education for climate change. In other words, we have to move away from strictly the natural sciences and understanding to the engagement of the social sciences. If we are actually going to do something about climate change or biodiversity, etc., we need to have an understanding of how does society change. And at that underpinning all of that change needs to be values and ethics. And the world's teachers really do not have a safe mechanism for addressing values and ethics, especially in societies where this is not seen as a common part of the school system. So that kind of a marriage would be great. But secondly, it would work equally well in the opposite direction. I think that the Earth Charter could benefit greatly also from links to education for sustainable development. Not only links into the formal education system, but also links into public awareness, and maybe even most importantly, links into training. Imagine using and building on what Brendan was talking about yesterday and bringing the Earth Charter into the training programs of the world's private sector corporations and our public sector. That could be a way. So being here in India, I think we should start discussing arranged marriages or something along that line. Now, ESD has many, many focus. We range in so many different ways as we start out with bits and pieces, and of course we need to sort of bring them together. But for this morning and this afternoon, what we're really looking at is what are some of the many different faces. And so the speakers that we have, we each have pledged, we will hold to the 10 minutes. And we're each going to present sort of a different approach. Even at that, it'll just be some of the many approaches that go on around the world.